Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today, we are going to be presenting on when the world feels like a scary place, talking to your children about the novel coronavirus. And before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment and introduce myself. My name is Brittany Jameson. I'm the Director of Minnesota Engagement with the Alumni Association. And I wanted to thank you for taking some time to spend with the Alumni Association today to dig into all of these wonderful pieces on how we can help our children accommodate this very chaotic and anxious time. As we get started here, I wanted to just at the very beginning thank our Alumni Association members. Our members are what make programs like this possible. If you would like to learn more about becoming a member of the Alumni Association or any of the other programs that we're offering, you can do that by visiting umnalumni.org. Additionally, we have this webinar, but many other webinars coming up throughout this current time of stay at home. We have been working hard to produce high quality content for all of you. So here on the screen, you can see a handful of webinars that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. They include on April 28th, which is next Tuesday, the personal economic impact of COVID-19, presented by an economist who works for the University of Minnesota. Then we also have a very interesting webinar digging into exploring Gen Z and what the future of work generation looks like. This is part of our series that's curated specifically for recent grads and upcoming grads. And then on the 30th, we have managing change and stress in unpredictable times, which I know is something that could probably benefit all of us right now. And just to make sure that we're handling all of the questions, if you have any problems utilizing Zoom, you can follow these directions. If you can't hear me or you would like to hear me better, if you're worried about kind of the audio issues and you joined via computer audio, we do have a dial-in option available for today's webinar. You can dial the number you see on your screen and then also enter that webinar ID down below that's prompted. Additionally, if you wanted to go directly from your phone, there's a dial-in one-click dial number where you just click it on your phone in the link that you received in the email today. Then the other important part of this is we're not just going to be speaking at you, we want to talk to you today. So we have a questions feature for webinars for today. And you can see whether on the right-hand side or kind of along the bottom, there's a place where you can submit your questions on that Q&A button. You can see a picture of it right now. That's a great place to put any questions related to content, anything you'd like to ask Abby, all of those kinds of pieces. There's also a chat box that some of you are already super interactive in. As I mentioned in the chat, unfortunately you aren't able to see your other attendees today, but you're welcome to interact with them that way. And we've also prepped a good handful of polls to kind of get a feel for who else is on the call with us and some more information. So those will be coming later on in kind of the audience participation part of this webinar. But without further ado, I want to get into the reason why we're all here. And that is one Dr. Abi Gewirtz. Dr. Gewirtz is the Lindahl Leadership Faculty Chair for the Department of Family Social Science and the Institute of Child Development. She is also the director for the Institute of Translational Research and Children's Mental Health in the University of Minnesota and the editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Psychology. Her research focuses on the development, effectiveness testing, and widespread implementation of targeted prevention programs that promote child resilience among highly stressed families, including those affected by military deployment and war. Over the past 15 years, Dr. Gewirz's research has been funded by the US National Institutes of Health, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, and the Department of Defense. She is also a published author and has presented widely on parenting, child trauma, child adjustment, and extending parent training models for populations affected by traumatic stress. And most excitedly, she is the author of the forthcoming book, When the World Feels Like a Scary Place, Essential Conversations for Anxious Parents and Worried Kids. So we are so excited to have you with us today. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Brittany. It's a treat to be here today, and I'm just sorry I can't actually see you all in person. I will just make a disclaimer, which is I wish my hair looked like the hair in that picture. As you can tell, as all of us feel, I think right now we haven't had a chance to have a haircut for a while. So that's just a light-hearted note to start off not a light-hearted subject. But I hope that what we're going to get to be able to do today is talk a little bit about how to help our kids deal with the novel coronavirus and the pandemic that is all around us. And I do want to say that my book, When the World Feels Like a Scary Place, so the webinar title is stolen from the book, but that book did not get written since the pandemic. That was something that I have been writing over the last couple of years, and it's just unfortunate timing, but that it's being released next month. But over the last few years, as a child psychologist and a researcher on trauma and families, I had really noticed how this generation of kids and teens really have been showing marked increases in anxiety and worries. And in a way, it's not surprising. And if I think back to the last 5 years, say since 2015, well, 2015 marked the highest movement of migrants around the world since World War II. So you've all seen pictures of Syrian refugees trying to get into Europe and other movements of people. We're dealing with climate change. Global climate change is a huge challenge. We in the US, unfortunately, have seen very widely publicized incidents of school shootings. We are a very divided democracy, and we've seen a decline in sort of social norms around civility and how we talk about things because we're much more polarized than we used to be. So these are challenges that I, back in 2015, 2016, 2017, was thinking about as a parent. I was wondering how my children are a little older there, in their teens, but I was wondering what it would be like to be a parent of a young child now. And so I decided to write this book about Scary World. And unfortunately, the Scary World theme is even more heightened these days with our pandemic. So what I'm going to talk about today is scary world events. What do they do to us parents? How do our preoccupations affect our kids, and how can we help our kids? That's the most important piece. But before we do that, I think I want to just ask you some questions. Normally I'd ask for a show of hands, so this is a virtual show of hands. Let us know, please, whether you're a parent and how old your kids are. And you can pick more than one. Obviously, most people, if they have more than one child, they're different ages. So go ahead and fill that form out, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I got interested in scary world events and trauma. As you can hear, even though I have been trying to perfect my Minnesota accent, I am not a Minnesotan. I was born and brought up in London, England. And in fact, it was 100 years ago, a little bit, maybe 100.5 years ago, that my great-grandfather died from the Spanish flu epidemic. He died in 1919. Then not 20-something years later, my dad was a young boy during World War II and the Blitz on London and the Battle of Britain. And at 5 years old in 1940, he was evacuated from London and spent the next 5 years barely seeing his parents. And that, together with an experience I had about in the late 80s, when I was living in Israel during the first Gulf War and ended up holed up in a large shelter with a gas mask on, made me think about what it must be like to be a parent of a child who's still at home, a child between the ages of 3 and 18, say, during traumatic events. And of course, there are many traumatic events that happen, and they can be traumatic disasters like we live in Tornado Alley, tornadoes and fires and earthquakes and tsunamis, or they can be interpersonal violence events like wars, for example, and they can be pandemics and illnesses as well. So, so there's a lot of scary things that can happen in terms of trauma. And so I became interested in understanding how we can help parents be their children's best teachers. And I've essentially devoted my career to developing programs and strategies to help parents be their kids' best teachers. And I want to acknowledge that there has been a fantastic body of research that I've only I feel like I've been able to stand on the shoulders of giants, people who've done tremendous work in the area of parenting and how to help parents. And my particular focus has been how to help parents during times of stress. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And I'm sorry that some of you haven't been able to answer the poll, but I don't know, Brittany, if you're able to share some of the results. Thank you. Okay. So 84% of you are parents. So the vast majority of you on the call today are parents. And it looks like most of you are parents of toddlers, preschoolers, elementary age kids, so young children or young adults or adults. So that's great. We have a nice wide range of parents here. And I'm going to ask you, and I'm glad to see that there are people who are not parents, might not be parents, but they are teachers. So that's fabulous, because teachers play huge roles in helping children to understand the world. So I'll have a couple more questions for you later. But for now, let's go on to the next slide, Brittany, and let's think about why is it important to help kids stay calm in an anxious world, and obviously how do we do that? So what I write about in the book is that the anxious world, the scary world around us, and I argue that the world is scarier than it was maybe a generation or two ago, certainly the way it felt to me when I was growing up, because we have 24/7, anytime, anywhere news all the time. So once your child goes off to school or they're out of the house, even in childcare, it's much harder for us to know what's happening to our kids. But we can be pretty sure that the outside world is filtering in. But I use the world filter because we parents and teachers are the impact of scary outside world events on kids. And what's so important is that through the ways we talk and behave with our children, we have the opportunity to show them predictability, safety, love, and security, even in a situation in which there's a lot of uncertainty and fear going on in the world. But saying that parents and other important adults are filters for kids is a lot easier said than done. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is something called an essential conversation. And those are conversations in which we adults are really able to listen to our kids, to hear their worries and concerns, to really hear them, and then to help them feel less anxious and able to engage in the world. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. So how do we help kids stay calm in an anxious world? What I would say first is that we adults have to deal with our own anxiety. And so, Brittany, I lost my slide now. Oh, there you go. I was going to say, I think this is the next poll. So how have you felt in the last 2 months? Have you, adults, parent, teacher, whoever, have you felt more anxious than usual? So I'd love to hear how to see how anxious people are feeling right now, because how we feel, how we adults feel, is very, very important for how our children feel and how our children will behave. And in order for us to truly be able to respond to our kids, we have to be able to have a handle on, which means knowing whether something bothers us and how it bothers us, and then doing something about that, even before we're able to listen and respond to our kids' worries. Okay, so wow, those 9% of you who are not feeling any more anxious than usual, you guys, good for you. And not surprisingly, over 90% of you are feeling a little more anxious or a lot more anxious. And it's interesting that it's split exactly halfway down the middle. Some people feel, half the people feeling a little more anxious and half the people feeling a lot more anxious. And of course, our anxiety relates to many, many things. We would never expect everybody to feel equally anxious, even in the face of a common threat, right? The pandemic affects us all. It's universal, but some of us have older parents, or we're medically compromised, or our significant other is medically compromised, or we have other reasons. We have a history of infectious disease or other illness. But there may be, or maybe we have a more than healthy dose of anxiety in general. So some of us may be more or less vulnerable to being anxious at any particular time. And that's why, of course, we see variations in anxiety. And let me just say at this point that anxiety is evolutionarily important. So we need anxiety. It's a signal. What does anxiety tell us? Well, if you sort of put your Stone Age hat on, you'll recall that, you know, back then, if a lion was coming and we didn't do something about it, we would be mauled and we wouldn't live. So in order to survive, we really need to be able to detect what's threatening or dangerous. And anxiety is that signal. It provides us with the signal that something's dangerous. So anxiety is an important signal, but sometimes it can really take us over. And so what we have to learn how to do is respond and not react. And I wish that I had more time to talk about us adults, but I spend a lot of time talking about it in the book. And I want to make sure that today we also have an opportunity to, I can see lots of, I'm not reading it, but I think there's quite a few questions and answers. And I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to address your questions. So I can certainly go into more details later. But at this point, let me also check in with you, Brittany, to see if there are any questions that you think are worth addressing right now, or should we just go straight to the next poll?
I think we can just keep on going to the next poll, but feel free to submit those questions through that Q&A box if you have any that are coming up. We're answering a couple of more like technical pieces on the webinar chat. I will take a moment though to say a full recording of this presentation plus any slides and resources that are mentioned will be sent in a post-webinar email. And that's a really great resource to be able to pass along to anyone who wasn't able to attend today or didn't register. It's really awesome. And it will also exist on our Alumni Association YouTube channel. So you'll have all of everything that we talk about today will be sent to you before the afternoon is up. So, but feel free to drop questions in that Q&A box.
Yay. We have another poll for you. And so we're gonna, I think Brittany just pulled that poll up. And here's the next question. So I asked you about your own anxiety, and now I'd like to ask you a little bit about your children's anxiety. And I'd like to know how many of you have noticed, or how many of you, for how many of you has it been clear that your child or children have seemed more anxious or not than usual? So take a second to, a few seconds to think that through, and then hopefully we'll get to see the results, and we'll go from there. But if we just talk a little bit about respond, don't react while you're filling that out, I would love it if you finished completing the poll, we could do a quick exercise, which is, for those of you who live with children, I would like you to think of the last time that you felt, that you experienced a big emotion. It doesn't have to be anxiety. It could be a time you were feeling anxious, but it could also be a time that you were preoccupied by something else: anger, disappointment, frustration. So I would like you to think about that time, and no one's going to ask you for a poll, but just think about that time. And then I would like you to think about whether your big emotions were evident to the kids that you live with or anyone else that you live with. So, so what I'm trying to get at is that we all have emotions. They are universal and they're fantastic emotions. We talked about anxiety as a signal. And sometimes emotions get really big. And when they get really big and they take us over, we know, because we might get anxious and then we can't stop thinking anxious thoughts, right? And then we know that our anxiety is kind of preoccupying us. So we might think, for example, oh my goodness, a friend of a friend who I saw at a party, and this could be, let's say last month, because we've all been in lockdown for a month or so, a friend of a friend who I saw at that party in March, came down with coronavirus and had to go to the hospital. Does that mean I could be at risk for getting coronavirus? Oh my goodness, maybe I've given coronavirus to my kids or to my parents. And I can give a personal example of that. In late February, I'm officially on sabbatical this semester, and I was out of the country. And in late February, my dad, who's 85 and lives in London, broke his hip and his femur and ended up in the hospital. And I traveled to London to be with him. And I was picked up at the airport by my brother and sister-in-law. And my sister-in-law was coughing. She's a doctor. And she said, I definitely don't have the coronavirus. And the next day she spiked a fever, and she did in fact have the coronavirus. And for several days, I don't remember feeling so overwhelmed by my worries as I did in that early March, when I was visiting my dad, who was in the hospital. And I knew I had to see him because there was nobody else who could go to see him because the rest of the family was sick. And I was so worried that I was going to catch the virus and give it to him, which could potentially be fatal. And so that's, I think that's sort of a pretty classic example of the way in which our own worries really can overtake us. And we can really have a series of thoughts that may or may not, in this case, there was nothing I could do about it, but that doesn't stop those thoughts coming. So have your children seem more anxious than usual? And it sounds like 88% of you said that your kids are either a little more anxious or a lot more anxious. And it's great that the vast majority of them are not a lot more anxious. And if we could do some more sophisticated polling, we'd ask if you could break down the anxiety by age, because I think that would be really interesting. Is it the younger kids who are less anxious or more anxious, or the teens who know more and who are in the world and on the online more and on social media with all of its fake news? Are they more anxious? That would be really, really interesting to find out. But yeah, not surprisingly, the overwhelming majority of our kids are also more anxious than they would normally be. And that's not surprising. We're in the middle of a really frightening time. So what do we do? What do we do when our kids are anxious and we're also anxious? And so what I've talked about up till now is really being aware of what the anxiety is doing to me first. And me means me and my partner or spouse, if I have one. And when I know what COVID-19 is making me feel like, then I can say, I feel anxious. I have butterflies in my stomach. My heart's beating fast. Wow, that news that I just read was really terrifying. And I can, when I'm aware of what the anxiety does to me, I can make a choice. Instead of freaking out, which I might be doing inside with my child, and saying, as it's very easy to do, wow, I cannot believe that young people are dying of strokes, which is something that came on the news yesterday and would be easy to do if you were playing CNN in your kitchen, and then seeing that your 6-year-old, whose grandmother had a stroke last year, so she knows what a stroke is listening to you saying, wow, all these young people are getting strokes, and might hear it in a different way from you. You might say to yourself, I can see this news is really freaking me out. So I'm gonna make a decision about compartmentalizing my own anxiety in one place, and I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna listen to my child's concerns. And actually, I'm gonna switch off CNN for a little bit, because CNN is not doing me any good, especially in the kitchen. So that's what I call respond, don't react. And so what does it look like? And we'll go through a brief snippet of a conversation. And so what does it look like to hear a little bit about how your child is feeling, whether they're slightly anxious, somewhat anxious, or very anxious? And you may not know how they're feeling, because not a lot of Americans don't, a lot of people around the world, we don't talk about feelings often. Some people do, but a lot of people don't. We don't learn about feelings in school so much, or now social and emotional learning curricula are becoming more common, which is fantastic. So your child might show you that they're anxious because they're not sleeping well, or because they're having nightmares. Maybe your child who's already been toilet trained is wetting the bed. Or maybe your child's just asking you a lot of questions about coronavirus, which is a signal that they're thinking about it a lot. And so the first thing to do might be to sit down and just ask them where they're feeling it, right? Gosh, you just were asking me all these questions about the coronavirus, and that says to me that you've been thinking about it. I wonder what you're feeling about it. I know that when I get anxious, I feel it in my tummy. I get butterflies. Does that ever happen to you? What you're doing by doing that is helping your child to identify feelings that go along with thoughts or questions or things like that. So you're allowing them an opportunity to link worry or anxiety with certain feelings in their bodies or looks on their faces. You might say, you have a frown on your face. I wonder if you're feeling worried or mad or sad that you can't go to school anymore and you miss your friends, for example. So that's what we call identifying and labeling emotions. And what does that tell your child? It says, I'm hearing and seeing the whole you, not just the content of the stuff that you're telling me. Because your child might say, hey, Mom, when can I go back to school? And a straightforward answer to that would be either, I don't know, the governor just said not this year, but I'm sure you'll be able to go back in September. But is that what your child is really asking you? I don't know. But if you ask them what they're feeling, it might give you a little bit of an opener into hearing more about why they're asking that question. I feel lonely. I miss my friends. I think I'm really worried about getting behind in school, etc. The next stage is to provide your kids with strategies to help them manage anxiety. And in the book, I talk a lot about managing our own anxiety using strategies, what we call emotion regulation strategies. And many of those strategies are great for our kids as well. Could be something as simple as 10 deep breaths, what we call belly breaths, or some mindfulness, 2-minute mindfulness exercise, or parent-child yoga, or going out for a walk, or taking a nice bath. So all those kinds of things that help you and your kids reduce the stress. And depending on, you can, things like taking a walk are great always. And, a bath can be a really nice relaxing thing before bed. And 10 deep breaths can be perfect in the moment when you're in the middle of a conversation and things are getting really intense. So once you've been able to help your child reduce anxiety in the moment, you have the opportunity to really validate what they're feeling. And that's especially true if a kid has really big anxious feelings like, why can't we go see grandma? And my friend's grandma is really sick and I'm really worried about grandma. And that gives you the opportunity to say, of course you're worried about grandma. It is worrying when you hear about someone's grandma who's gotten sick and we can't even visit our grandma. And so validating kids emotions lets them know that their concerns are being heard and they're valid concerns. And then once we've had a chance to validate their worries, then we get a chance to help them do something about it, right? And that's what I call the problem-solving stage. And sometimes it includes setting limits as well, but let's just talk a little bit about problem solving, right? And that could be, we can't visit grandma, but we can make stuff for her. Or we can even walk over to her house and we can touch the outside of the window and she can touch the inside of the window. Or we can FaceTime her and we can see her on the computer or the phone. And those are not necessarily all things that you're going to suggest. The beauty about problem solving is you give your kids a chance to brainstorm about things that they want to do, both to help them feel less anxious and to address the problem, which is we can't see, I'm worried about grandma and I can't see her. And sometimes you have to set limits, right? You have a child who is coming into your bedroom every night and you've always had a rule that we all stay in our beds, for example. I'm not saying everyone should have a rule. This is really about your values. But if that's the rule you've made, and now sort of everything's out the window because people are feeling stressed, you might decide to set a limit around it, which is, I'm going to help you feel less anxious and we're going to create a new routine around bedtime. And we're going to find special rewards, the special treats we had to help you stay in your bed when you were younger, and we're going to try those again. And maybe we need to set new rules and routines to help kids feel more secure at this difficult time. So in a very rapid nutshell, and I apologize for the rapidity of the nutshell, I've just sort of sketched out the kinds of ways that we can talk to our kids about COVID-19, about coronavirus. And we have a few questions. And so why don't you move to the next slide, Brittany, and then, I'll get to this, but let's hear a few questions and I can maybe answer them and weave in the slide.
Absolutely. So one of the first questions, oops, video wasn't on. Hello, everyone. One of the first questions was, what would be some mindfulness activities for kind of that 3-year-old preschool range?
Great question. Perfect question. Yeah. So one of my favorite activities with even little kids like 3-year-olds is a belly breathing activity. And what I say to very little kids, and you can do this with a real balloon if you have one, but I say we're going to pretend we're blowing up a balloon, right? So we're going to breathe in and take a big breath, because when we blow up a balloon, we need a big breath to blow it up. So we're going to take a big breath in. And now we're going to take the balloon and how big can you make the balloon? Because the more we breathe out into it, the bigger the balloon's going to be. And what's lovely about that is that we know that the best kind of belly breathing for healthy heart rate variability is a breath that's like 5 breaths in, 10 breaths out. So your out breath is longer than your in breath. But try explaining that to a 3-year-old, right? But if you can say balloon breathing, that's a really fun thing to do. Yeah, just one thing. So
I need to do that for me.
Right? Don't we all?
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is from Heather, and she says, my teenager keeps his emotions inside. However, he has expressed that he doesn't like this online learning and it makes him feel anxious. School is more routine, which he needs, and his defense mechanism is to go to the Xbox or zone out. I try to get him outside and get fresh air, but he doesn't. Any ideas to help get him out and be more functional, to be more part of the family?
Yeah, that is such a great question. Thank you. It's online learning is so hard. I mean, we have all our 4 kids at home. Actually, my oldest is not home anymore, but three kids, all at various stages of doing online learning. And, one of them loves it, 2 of them love it and can work it pretty independent. One's more of a young adult, so she does her own thing. One's doing great, and the other one just can't bear it. And she's just wants to be doing, she wants to be, doing stuff. She's not that kind of learner. And so what I would say is, I think you're on the right track about small chunks. And we talk about setting kids up for success with small steps. And so I don't know, given what the parameters are about your child's classroom, but I would say the extent to which you can reward your child in small steps. So say 15 minutes on, 5 minutes off, 20 minutes on, 5 minutes off, 30 minutes, depending on how old they are, and really making sure that you get to reward them with stuff that they like to do, whether it's getting outside, which is great because exercise is phenomenal, or a small snack, or even like just you rock high five, and even maybe keeping track. We, in our parenting programs, we do things like we use tokens, and those could be small things like, we call them Scooby Loops. They're little bracelets, and you could just sidle up to your kid and put a Scooby Loop on the desk. For every 10 minutes, they stay with their bottom on the chair and paying attention. And that if they add up the Scooby Loops, and the end of the day, they have 10, they can trade them in at the store for 15 minutes extra reading time, for example, or choose a snack for tomorrow, or things like that. But yeah, it's really hard. I just want to acknowledge, I want to normalize how hard it is to have your kids at home and doing school at home. And especially for those of you who are working, to juggle all this is really tough. Do you want one more question, or should we talk about conversations and we can just finish up with the slides? What do you think, Brittany?
Yeah, let's go on to conversations, then we'll come back to the questions. I will make one mention. Shannon in the chat mentioned that she has a 4 and a 6-year-old, and they've been doing a podcast called Like Your Mindfulness for Kids, and she's really loved that. So that's a great age-appropriate resource as well.
Yay, thank you. And there's Mind Kind and Calm. Calm's it's for older kids. There's some really cool mindfulness apps for kids. So I think that's a lovely thing to do, when kids get upset, or even right before bedtime, for example, especially if kids are having a hard time sleeping. So in the book, I talk about conversations, and I talk about conversations about all kinds of things, from climate change to violence and, of course, pandemic. But I think one of the things about conversations that I was really curious about is, I have 4 kids, and when they were young, to balance having kids and a career, and house stuff and feeding them and after school activities was crazy. And so I was really interested in data on how much time we spent talking to our kids. And I went to something called the National Time Use Surveys, which is a fantastic resource. Every year, a representative sample of the population are polled to see how they spend their time. And so I looked at the item that said, how much time in any given day do you spend as a primary activity talking with or to your children? Primary activity. And I wish I could do a poll now, but I won't, because we don't have time and we didn't set it up ahead of time. But let me tell you that the average amount of time people who had children living with them at home reported spending as a primary activity talking with their children was 3 minutes. 3 minutes a day talking with their children as a primary activity. I was shocked. Now, there's all sorts of problems with averages, and I talk about that, and so I'm just going to caveat that. But what it does say is that most parents, and I will say most parents, 80% of parents said 0, right? Didn't even put it down as a topic. The other 20% spent a lot more time talking with their kids. So that's the backstory. So I decided to sort of set something called the Take 10 Challenge. And I'm going to give you guys the Take 10 Challenge. And I'm going to bet that you all are in the 20% that reported spending a lot more time talking with your children, because witness, you're here. My Take 10 Challenge is take 10 minutes every day to have what I call an essential conversation with your kids. And that is a conversation of the type that I just described, where instead of us zoning out, we're on our phones, we're trying to empty the dishwasher and cook and organize people to do chores at the same time. We're really taking 10 minutes just to talk with our kids. Doesn't mean you can't do anything else. Doesn't mean you have to sit and stare at them. You can go for a walk together. You can even be sitting in the car together, but just primarily your goal in these 10 minutes is to have a conversation with your kids. And most of the time, those conversations won't be profound conversations. But what you're doing is you're opening the door to listening, so that when your kids are really anxious, they'll tell you and they'll share, and you'll have had time to practice listening to their concerns, validating their emotions. And the mom who said, my child's doesn't talk a lot about his feelings, I think you're in the majority when it comes to teens. They don't tend to talk about their feelings, except if they're telling you they're anxious. That's a really good and important thing, and it's a great window for you to have an essential conversation. And in the book I give all sorts of examples about how we can do it when kids when they're kind of awkward, in that awkward teen stage, and they don't want you to be saying, where do you feel it in your tummy, right? Do you feel it in your tummy? And that could be modeling, sitting across the table from your partner or spouse and saying, I felt really worried today because of this thing that happened. And gosh, I felt it like I had to run to the restroom. I felt it in my stomach, or I suddenly got all hot and sweaty. And what that is doing is modeling for kids that it's okay to talk about your feelings. So that's just one example for teens. When you have this conversation about coronavirus or any other related scary thing, ask yourself first, do I have a personal stake in the discussion? And how might that affect the discussion, just like my anxiety? Am I on the same page as my partner or co-parent, right? How often have we started a conversation thinking we're on the same page, and then the other person says, you're like, what did you just say? So have a chance to prep if you can. And then Brittany, you could go on to the next slide. And how much does this issue affect us? And for most of us, it really is unfortunately beginning to directly affect us, whether it's because our kids aren't in school or because we already are knowing people who had the virus. What does my child understand, right? So some of you have 3-year-olds, and some of you have, or babies, and some of you have 18 or 21-year-olds. So that's really important, is to understand what they are able to understand about the virus and about what's going on in the world. And what can I do in this conversation to help my child worry less? What level of detail am I willing to provide, which relates to how old they are and how much they know? And what tools do I have at my disposal to help my child with her big emotions? And you could go on to the next slide. So like I said, I wrote this book before the coronavirus. The final draft was done last fall. And when the pandemic hit, the publisher asked me, look, it's not out, it's not published yet, would you be willing to add a conversation about the coronavirus? And so what you're seeing to the right of the picture of the book is just a clip from the coronavirus conversation, but you can download it or you can go see it for free on my website. And it has a little bit more information similar to what I've been talking about today. So I would suggest, I'm happy to take you through the conversation, but I would suggest maybe we answer a couple more questions and then we talk through the conversation.
I think that sounds like a great idea. Let's see, Sarah Witt says, when we go back to the real world, what do you think will be important to talk about with kids? I'm a teacher and want to be able to talk about it and answer questions in a constructive way without it feeling scary.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Because, you know, those of us who think that when it's over, and we can just all get back to normal, that never happens that way. Never happens, doesn't happen with tornadoes and fires, and it's not going to happen with this pandemic. And just a small snippet. When I was in London, I was talking to my sister-in-law who has a 4-year-old, and I was asking her how, as I was thinking about the conversation that I was writing, I was asking her about what her son talked about and how she explained the coronavirus to him. And she said, well, in school, in preschool, he's been learning about germs. And so I said, oh, the coronavirus is a kind of germ, and we can get it by going outside. And so we just have to be careful to wash our hands. And and my bing, 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 my child psychologist alarms went off, because we had a similar instance in some of the work that we were doing way pre-coronavirus with our military families, when we had parents who were trying to explain deployment to their children. So a mom whose husband was going out to Afghanistan to fight, and she would say to her son, well, daddy has to go to work, right? And then when he came back from deployment and he went to work that wasn't back to Afghanistan, the kids would freak out, because work was the name they'd used for going off to fight in a war thousands of miles away. And so just like that, I was sort of saying to my sister-in-law, you know, I wonder how he's going to feel about, like, we use the word germs to describe anything. There's lots of stuff that could be germs. And so you just want to make sure that he's not scared to go outside forever. Not forever, but, you know, he's only 4. So what he understands is different from what you understand. So, so that's, I think, you know, just something to think about. And now I lost my thread, and I want to make sure I answered the question.
She was talking about, as a teacher, how do I align?
So thank you. I gave you that like little snippet, because what it illustrates is how the kids coming into your classroom are going to have all different kinds of ideas about what they've just been through. And so I think it would be phenomenal when you do come back to the classroom, who knows when that will be, to be able to have some opportunity to process what's happened with the kids without making them more frightened. So one lovely thing to do, if you have the opportunity, and I know teachers are so overworked, so I even hesitate to say this, but if you have the opportunity to send out an email before you go back to school that asks parents what their kids have been talking about or preoccupied about, or whether they have any worries, that will give you a really, really good sense of what you have when you come into the classroom. Because I really agree with your point that we have to be very careful not to let kids tell us stuff that will freak out other kids. I think that's the worry, right? As a teacher, you say, listen, it's not my job to figure out what I can and can't tell the children. But if a kid puts his hand up in class and says, my grandma died, and the other kids didn't have that experience, that you're dealing with a class of kindergartners, obviously you're never going to stop a child putting their hand up, but you are not going to start a conversation about death necessarily. And so I think that what you're thinking about is so on point, and really thank you for being so intentional.
In a similar vein, Christina is wondering how the book is structured. Are there like workbook-like sections or pieces that could be easily used to guide conversations? And if not, are you considering following up with something that might be in line with that kind of resource?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So basically, the first few chapters of the book, so I think I said, like, you know, the very beginning just sets the stage about why is parenting today different from parenting in eras past, like when we were kids. Then I talk a little bit, just have a chapter on how anxiety affects us. And then the next couple of chapters are how anxiety affects our kids and different kinds of kids, who, you know, the range of kids and ages and anxiety. So talk a little bit about anxiety by age or by developmental stage. And then what are some strategies that you can use to help your kids deal with anxiety? And then the conversation, the sort of structure of the conversation I talked about earlier, you know, this sort of helping kids identify emotions and then validating. I take people through that. It's called emotion coaching is the process, and we talk about that. And the whole second half of the book really focuses on 5 classes of scary world events. And this was why I wrote the book. Climate change, violence, particularly focused on school shootings, which I think have really taken up so much of our attention in the last few years. Now that we don't have school, it's kind of hard to remember them, but just in the fall, I was at a few school conferences talking about that. So violence in school and the community, climate change, technology, and how things like social media bullying and how technology can be both a blessing and a curse. Monitoring, what are the scary things sometimes that kids can learn about or hear about or be exposed to using technology, social media apps, YouTube, things like that. Then there's a chapter on social justice issues. So things like poverty, for example, or I'm trying to think about other examples. So, extremism. And then there's a chapter on our divided society, which is how to, dealing with things like our divided views when it comes to elections or immigration, things like that. And I just want to make it clear. So each chapter has multiple conversations about different kinds of issues. So for example, there's one on in the climate change chapter. There's I'll take the school violence chapter. There's a lockdown drill conversation with a kindergartner. There's a 10-year-old who's sent home from school early because of a threat, which unfortunately isn't as rare as we'd want. There's a vandalism in the community that's driven by religious bias, etc. The goals of the conversation are not to tell parents what to say to their kids about these things, because parents have completely different views about things. The goal is, and early in the book we talk about values and how values drive what we talk about in conversations. But the goals of the script, the conversations in each of the chapters, so like 5 conversations, each with a different kind of age group, are really to help parents think about the process of having a conversation. So I think that's kind of a nice segue into this. And so, for example, this is, an add-on conversation that I didn't anticipate writing about. I certainly didn't have a chapter on pandemics. And hopefully there won't be any need for a chapter on pandemics, because this will be the only one for the next 100 years, who knows. But this is just a standalone conversation that's also just on my website. And it's Marcy and Frank know their kids have heard about the virus, but they haven't had a chance to sit down and talk with them. This afternoon, though, their daughter Deborah was on FaceTime with her best friend Nina, and later came into the kitchen crying. Nina's grandma was just diagnosed with the illness and is in the hospital. And so, how does mom talk about it? So, Mom, honey, you look so sad. I can see that your mouth is turned down and your eyes are so wet. Are you feeling sad or something else? And Deborah says, Mom, my friend Nina says that lots of people are dying from the coronavirus. Her grandma's in the hospital. Is she going to die? And so Mom is like, oh my goodness, she hadn't anticipated this. This was coming, she hadn't heard about it. In this case, her child heard about it first. So she takes a deep breath, which is such a great go-to. She says, let's sit down. I just took your favorite cake out of the oven and I'll get you a glass of milk to go with it. And let me just say that in the original version of this script, the kids were coming off the school bus. So this is how things change so quickly with this virus. You remember the time when there was talk about the virus, but kids were still going to school. Anyway, so Mom uses the together, and I sort of talk about like just taking little breaks just to give yourself a couple of minutes to gather your thoughts. So she says, goodness, I'm guessing your conversation with Nina involved lots of emotions. And then, so what Mom's doing is trying to find out first, what's Deborah feeling and what's Deborah thinking? And so Deborah says, Nina's so worried for her grandma. I'm so sad for Nina. Her grandma's really sick from the corona. Well, everybody get it now. Is our grandma Joan going to get sick? Which is, of course, what she was thinking, but we wouldn't necessarily assume that, given what she started off by saying. And Mom says, you sound pretty worried as well as sad. What are you feeling in your body? And you can flip to the next slide, Brittany. Deborah says, my tummy feels funny and my head hurts a bit. Can kids get coronavirus? So here's one other thing that Mom's now learning. It's not really just that she's worried about grandma getting the virus, but of course she's also worried about her and probably her mom and dad and her siblings. So Mom says, I wonder if you're wondering whether you might be sick too. Wow, that's a lot to think and worry about. I would be worried too if I were you. So that's what we call validating. I remember when I was your age and my friend Samantha, her grandma got really sick. And then Samantha got sick too. She was fine. She just had the flu, but we were all worried that we would get sick and end up in the hospital. And that's what we call validating by personal example. So what she's saying, what's mom saying to Deborah? It's like, yeah, your worries are really valid. And not only would I be worried too if I was sitting where you were sitting, but you know, when I was a kid, that made me worried too. So she's helping Deborah to identify what she's feeling by reflecting on her expressions, asking her about her bodily feelings. And she's now being able to identify Deborah's core concern, which is whether she and her grandma, and probably mum too, might get sick. So I'm going to stop it here because the rest of the conversation is on my website. But mom then says, wow, this is a big conversation. Let's wait till dad gets home and let's bring your brother in. Let's have a family meeting after dinner and talk about it. And so, so I think you can go on to the next slide, which I'm afraid is not the end of the, it's not the end of the script. You have to go to the website for that, or the book. But you know, in conclusion, please take 10 for essential conversations, whether they're about the coronavirus or anything else. We will never regret spending more time talking with our kids, ever. And I believe that conversations are the best way, and our research has shown us that conversations are the best way to help kids navigate scary events and the big feelings they engender. And there we are. And fortunately, we've had some time for questions. I think we only have 2 more minutes.
Yeah.
Do you want a last question, or?
I think let's do one last one. And I'm going to kind of combine a few, because there's quite a few people in the questions and in the chat who have said their kids are feeling bigger emotions, like that first realization, whether they're preteens or kind of in that younger space where they're all of a sudden being confronted with the fact that the world is a bigger and scarier place. And it's coming out in the way that they're acting, whether it's nighttime and not being able to sleep when they're kind of separate from parents, or kind of Mary, who said her 6-year-old seems to be kind of projecting the emotions that she thinks her 6-year-old thinks she wants her to feel. I don't know what she's actually feeling. So how do we deal with some of those recommendations for kids that are now being faced with the world is not the closed bubble that we hoped it would feel to them?
Right. And for us, that, I mean, I'm sure for you guys too, I'm just going to speak for myself, that involves certain feelings of loss, you know, loss of innocence, right? The bubble, no bubble, you know. And so we have, you know, and that's why I think now more than ever it's so important for us to be able to help ourselves, look after ourselves, so that we can still provide some kind of a bubble for our kids. And yay, Mary, was it Mary who said about not knowing what her kid was feeling? Because our kids are brilliant detectives. I think someone wrote that even. Kids are super intuitive, right? Kids are brilliant feelings detectives. And I write about that, you know. They know what they can read us like a book, and they also know what we want from them, you know. And that's the basis of sort of, I mean, a lot of attachment is, you know, not just, I know my mom loves me, but I'm going to make sure that my mom continues to love me too. And of course, our love is unconditional. But kids really, they are attached, and so they know what we feel. And so that's what, you know, when parents are really overwhelmed, sometimes what happens is that kids become very worried about their parents and they want to look after them. And so that's why I think it's really important for us to be able to set not pretend we feel something that we don't, or we don't feel something we do, but just get some space from it, so we can give our kids the message that I want to know what you are feeling, not what you think I want to know, or you reflecting my feelings. And so let's just, I am sad, and I am sad that you can't go to school, and this virus thing it's scary, and my job is to look after you. And here are the ways in which I look after you. We wear masks and we wear gloves and we stay at home and we don't visit grandma. And let's brainstorm some other ways in which we can let grandma know we love her, for example, or in which we can still have fun even with online school and no friends.
Thank you so much. This was very helpful. I hope everybody on the presentation today enjoyed it. As I mentioned, there's a bunch of people in the chat that are saying thank you and appreciative of all that you've presented today, Abby. As a reminder, we have the following upcoming webinars listed. I won't go in detail about them, but I will let you know that we are going to send out that email. It has a survey, and that survey is to help us make sure that these kinds of topics are helpful to you and that the experience was what you wanted to do, and was in a way that you could easily digest and process it, because that's important to us. And then all of the resources that were talked about today, including the website that has that conversation about coronavirus and some of those other pieces, will be available with that recording. And if at any time you have any questions, my contact information and the contact information for our team is listed on that umnalumni.org website. So I'm just gonna take this as an opportunity to give one last thank you. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day and is walking out of this conversation empowered to handle those difficult conversations.
And thank you everyone for being your kids' best teachers.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.